What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Pokémon Day is coming up soon, and generally that means we're going to get a Pokémon Presents. This is a Nintendo Direct-style presentation that shows off a bunch of things that nobody really cares about, like Pokémon Cafe Mix, Smile, or Sleep, but then at the end they do always cram in something special to get everyone hyped. Pretty much guaranteed to be a tease for the big tentpole game that they'll be releasing later that year. Forget for a second on whether or not they should push one out. The reality is they will, so in that case, what could possibly be done for the big Pokémon game this year? Well, I took a poll of you all, and after thousands of responses, let's see what the wisdom of the crowd has settled upon. Seeing as how the last 2 years have given us a new generation and the update to those games, I think we can safely assume that it's way too early for Generation 10, so if we're still in Gen 9, then what will they decide to give us? According to the votes of the fans, almost a good 2/3 of people think that another Legends-style game is most likely to come to us later this year. Now maybe I did skew the results a bit because I did combine the idea of a Legends Johto and a Legends Unova game, sort of an either-or, so maybe some of the fans would have split that vote further, but I think it's pretty clear that the Pokemon Legends format really struck a chord. And it's pretty obvious why. This was the sharpest shakeup of the standard Pokemon formula that we had seen since Alola, but maybe much further back. We still capture a team of monsters, but the format was totally different, allowing us to interact with the world around us like never before, actually leaving an impact on the environment, and taking your surroundings into account, since you had to perfectly angle your Pokeball throw, or even dodge a Pokemon's attack. The simple fact that you could avoid a battle altogether with a single toss, or conversely, if you miss, enrage the Pokemon and actually take damage yourself, rejuvenated the love of Pokemon for many out there. And of course there was the entirely new crafting system that added a completely different element that Pokemon had never seen before. And of course it was astounding to have the entire setting of the game be a radical departure from anything that had come before, flinging us into the far past with a rudimentary world that we get to help set up, with fun references to things that we know will unfold in the future, so the idea of that happening for a different region has untold possibilities and lets the fans run wild with imagination. And the two headliners right now are the Johto and Unova regions, for varying reasons. Unova seems like it could be the next one considering we just had Sinnoh, so in theory that lines up. However, I think people are overlooking the remake patterns. It may have seemed haphazard before, but let's go really put things into perspective. We'll talk more about that later, but after Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, everyone expected us to immediately confirm Sinnoh remakes, but that didn't happen. Instead, we went to Kanto again, and this was because back in the day, after Hoenn debuted, we got to return to the Kanto region with Fire Red and Leaf Green, only then reaching Sinnoh. I've heard this well put before, and I agree. Pokemon like to keep all of their mainline regions as fresh in people's minds as they can. If they could keep fans interested in Elekid, Houndoom, and Skarmory with minimal effort, imagine the pool of extra merchandising that they could get away with. No one region should be out of the limelight for too long. And according to the calendar, it's been much longer since the last time we were in Johto versus when we last rolled up to Unova. Also, I think Johto is better suited to host a Legends game with a deeper connection to its past, getting recognizable locations like Ecruteak City or Sprout Tower, and also you kinda have the perfect excuse for more space-time distortions if you wanted to do that with Celebi running around. But aside from that, the story of a Legends Johto game seems a little less suitable since there are very few other Legends upon which to base a narrative, nor would it make sense for an antiquated Team Rocket to be there, but a lot of the Johto Pokemon would be quite fun to use in the altered battle system. And that is one more thing. As much as most players loved the direction of Legends Arceus, multiple responses said that they needed to flesh out the experience more, since even with adding these stance changes, the battles could really still use things like hold items or abilities, and frankly just more trainer battles in general, which would have created a nice balance from all the catching that you have to do over and over again. However, given the backlash of the too faithful Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, it's entirely possible that the Unova region would be the way to go, so as not to run the risk of Johto being too similar to what it was before. A Unova Legends game would be quite different from the one in the Hisui region, with totally different landscapes and peoples to check out, and here the story could go in all sorts of wild directions, from the Swords of Justice, or maybe a rivalry between Victini and Meloetta, or maybe the original dragon that Kyurem used to be. Unova seems primed for a Legends game instead of a boring retread of the original Black and White, and the fans seem ready for another stab at the Legends formula with its unique catching mechanics and the gameplay synergizing down to the environment around you. Again, with these numbers of votes, that means literally multiple thousands of people want another Legends game, and they seem to want it this year, only 2 and change after the original. However, if they did want a more standard Unova game, retreading the first Black and White wouldn't necessarily be a foregone conclusion. After all, Black and White 2 were so different from any Pokémon games to come out before or since, really making their mark as more than just the last game with tweaks. They were entirely separate entities. So they couldn't just drop some clever hints about the third version and call it a day. There would be entire towns and gyms totally unaccounted for. You might say that that's par for the course these days, but if any of the original crazy ambitious spirit is left that created Black and White 2 in the first place, I reckon that they would take it a step further and give us another full-blown sequel. It may be a fool's hope, but putting Black and White 3 as an option for selection easily won a quarter of all of the votes cast, since people are so ready to have their nostalgia for the final DS games actually addressed. If we made the same amount of changes that the sequels did and had a Unova game on the Switch be a few years after that, we wouldn't have to worry about seeing all of the gyms just like we did before. We can have replacements for types that weren't even ever shown in the original Gen 5 games. Or we could have other returning trainers and even see what Team Plasma's schemes might lead to, capping it all off with In and the previous player characters having Zekrom and Reshiram. It could be incredibly satisfying to have such creativity revisited after so many years, but I think the comments are right to say that it would take a bit too much commitment by the creatives to make such a game, at least one that's in a workable state upon release, since that is a quite common worry amongst the fans, and for pretty good reason. But even if it is quite possibly the least likely, the Unova 3D sequel makes account for a good fourth of all of the votes cast, which means that they still command a decent devotion in the fan base. Although, for the people claiming that the Unova games can't come out this gen because they have to be double the generation in which they appeared, that's just never been proven. Fire Red and Leaf Green were in Gen 3, and Let's Go certainly throws that out the window. I mean, that would be like saying that there must be a third game after each pair in a new region. That trend hasn't been a thing since 2014, so any other trend that happens to line up is similarly meant to be broken eventually. Now for the next most popular option, I was a bit surprised, but around a steady 10% voted for a new Let's Go style game for the Johto region. Remember what I said about Johto making the most sense to be next in the lineup? Well, this is a totally legitimate way for them to check off that box. And like others have said, it wouldn't actually be that hard to do with the limited scope of those faithful recreations of Gold and Silver. Or I guess technically it would be Crystal, since the original Kanto Let's Go games were based around Yellow version, so maybe that would make it harder because you would have to figure out which Pokemon would be the starters. I can't expect everyone to be like me and want to see Phanpy and Apom on the covers, but I think there's a solid pool with Pichu, Marill, Togepi, Teddiursa, maybe even Snubbull or Mareep. The point is it can be done, but the question is, would it be prudent? Probably the main selling point of the Let's Go games was to draw in Pokemon Go players to a main console version of Pokemon after decades away, or maybe for the first time ever. And to my shock, I've actually heard stories of it working and converting those casual users into Pokemon players. However, would that need to happen again? That's where the idea kind of clashes a bit, since many longtime Pokemon fans were willing to put up with the altered catching mechanics for one game, but they don't seem too keen on trying it again. Granted, there are individuals that loved the shakeup of the formula, along with other improvements that the games made, like having all of the Pokemon be visible in the overworld, which was a shocking development, and even being able to see whether a Pokemon was shiny or not before you encountered it, which was amazing for shiny hunting or just randomly finding one. But that's the dice that you're rolling by having another Let's Go set of games. Do you want to alienate prolonged fans in the hopes of wrangling some new ones? However, part of the hesitation for a new Let's Go outing was the lack of battling. So, like the complaint in Legends, it would be beneficial to add more trainer battles in a Let's Go Johto game, so that catching wild Pokemon is not the only thing that you're doing for hours upon hours of gameplay. However, I'll go so far as to say that Let's Go was one of, if not the best Pokémon experiences on the Switch, with how focused and polished everything was. The naturally limited roster made it so that you could create unique animations for every Pokémon, and distinct methods of walking alongside them, or in many cases, actually riding said Pokémon. Plus, the confined spaces meant that they didn't need to try a huge open world, but could properly polish every single corner of this world that they were showing us. And frankly, Let's Go has surpassed any expectations of success by selling 15 million copies, being the best-selling of any games that didn't start a generation, quietly racking up sales in the background at about 1 million a year. So, since a good portion of the fans are sick of getting half-baked games shoved out the door all the time, a relatively low-effort game such as Let's Go Johto might be the perfect stopgap measure to keep up engagement without sacrificing a grander idea on the altar of needing a new game all the time. And if I'm honest, the last option reflects this with a constant 5% of other, where people commented that they would really like for Pokémon to just take a break for once, and I couldn't agree more. There hasn't been a gap in the main series of Pokémon in almost 10 years when we used to get them pretty regularly, and it's starting to show. The creatives are being run ragged and the games are filled with holes. So a nice break of no mainline games would allow them the time and energy to fully flesh out whatever the next major game is supposed to be, which really works out in everyone's favor. Now that's not to say that the whole year would be a wash. While the year after Oros was void of any main series, it had plenty of other options, headlining with Super Mystery Dungeon, while being flanked by the likes of Pokemon Rumble World, Pokemon Picross, and Pokemon Shuffle. Now, it is true that I did make fun of those kind of side materials near the start of this video, but Mystery Dungeon is an interesting one, because many commenters who voted other specifically mentioned Mystery Dungeon, either as another remake of the Explorers set of games, like we already saw with the DX version on the Switch, or perhaps a brand new one outright. I was frankly surprised that it was such a popular sub-series, but I think a new Mystery Dungeon with Pokemon that weren't even around a decade ago with the last new one could be a wonderful thing to grow that brand after the DX remake revitalized interest. Also, a surprising amount of people requested a new Pokemon Stadium game, or perhaps even another game like Colosseum or XD. Before, I would say that any Stadium or even Battle Revolution continuation would be totally pointless. However, with the main games not having all of the Pokemon available, that alone makes a compelling case for their existence. Also, someone's idea of having different modes for all of the past gimmicks in a new stadium is pretty great, and it would please all camps, no matter what their favorite generation was, to have them all be represented. Or if you did have a new story added that would be like Gale of Darkness, fans would be falling all over themselves to try it out. Or honestly, you could probably just re-release both of those older games, like they've been doing for so many other GameCube titles on the Switch. That would stir so much hype and could easily anchor an entire year, especially if it were sprinkled in with other popular offerings like new Snap DLC levels, or maybe that new Mystery Dungeon game fans want, or hey, how about a new Pokemon Ranger game after all this time? Or they could really be totally out of left field and finally give us the Pokemon Z version that we all expected years ago but never got. The point is, there is a seriously large contingent of fans that would not only be fine with, but prefer a break. Will that happen? Almost certainly not, because honestly, Pokemon has been selling far too well on the Switch for them to ever stop, and then again, it is hard to ignore looking at the number of voters who do actively want some kind of new mainline Pokemon game this year. And with the exception of the Black and White Trilogy Enders, they do seem to be less ambitious titles overall, so they could be good candidates for a sort of filler slot, and perhaps we will see what the fans want and maybe get a new Legends game this year. But whatever it is, let's hope they have time to provide a reasonably refined product. What do you foresee as the next logical Pokemon game? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.